On January 5th, 1066, King Edward the Confessor drew his final breath in his palace at Westminster, and with that breath went any hope of a peaceful succession for the English throne. The king had no children, no direct heir, and no clear plan for what would happen to his kingdom. In the days that followed his death, England found itself at the center of a perfect storm. Three powerful men, each with their own claim to the crown, each willing to wade through rivers of blood to take it. The first to move was Harold Godwinson, the most powerful earl in England and Edward's brother-in-law. Within hours of the king's death, Harold had convinced the Witenagemot, the council of English nobles, to elect him as king. By the end of that same day, January 6th, 1066, Harold Godwinson was crowned in Westminster Abbey. His coronation rushed through with unseemly haste that spoke volumes about the instability he feared was coming. But Harold's swift coronation had done nothing to secure his throne. Instead, it had painted a target on his back that could be seen from across the North Sea. Across the water in Normandy, Duke William, who would later be known to history as William the Conqueror, received the news with cold fury. Edward had supposedly promised him the throne years earlier, and Harold himself had sworn an oath to support William's claim. To William, Harold was nothing more than an oath-breaker and a usurper, and he began immediately to gather an invasion force to take what he believed was rightfully his. Even more dangerous was the claim from the north. Harald Hardrada, King of Norway, was arguably the most fearsome warrior alive in 1066. His claim to the English throne came through a convoluted connection to King Knut, the Danish king who had ruled England a generation earlier. The claim was tenuous at best, but Hardrada didn't particularly care about the legal niceties. He had spent his entire life taking what he wanted through force of arms, and England, with its rich farmland, prosperous towns, and strategic position, was the greatest prize in Western Europe. England in the 11th century was no backwater. It was one of the wealthiest kingdoms in Europe, with a sophisticated administration, a strong currency, and productive agriculture. Control of England meant control of trade routes, enormous tax revenues, and a powerful base from which to project force across the continent. Every ambitious ruler in Europe understood this, which is why three of them were now preparing to fight for it. What made Harold's position even more precarious was the betrayal of his own brother. Tostig Godwinson had been Earl of Northumbria until the previous year, when his brutal rule had sparked a rebellion. Harold, as the newly crowned king, had sided with the rebels and exiled Tostig rather than risk civil war. Tostig had not forgiven this betrayal. Consumed by bitterness and rage, he had spent months traveling across Europe seeking allies, and he had finally found one in Harald Hardrada. The Norwegian king and the exiled English earl made a pact. Together they would invade England, defeat Harold, and divide the kingdom between them. As spring turned to summer in 1066, Harold Godwinson found himself in an impossible position. He knew invasions were coming, but he didn't know when or where. William was gathering ships and men in Normandy, clearly preparing for an assault across the Channel, but the winds were wrong for a crossing, and Harold had positioned his army along the southern coast, watching and waiting for the Norman fleet to appear on the horizon. What Harold couldn't have known was that the first blow would come not from the south, but from the north. While he watched the Channel, Harald Hardrada was assembling the largest Viking invasion force in a generation. The Norwegian king was not called Hardrada, which means hard ruler or harsh counsel, for nothing. At 51 years old, he was a legend across the Norse world, a man whose reputation for violence and strategic brilliance had been earned in blood across 3 continents. They called him the Thunderbolt of the North, and even his allies feared him. Hardrada's life read like something from mythology. At the age of 15, he had fought alongside his half-brother King Olaf at the Battle of Stiklestad in Norway. When Olaf was killed and their forces defeated, the teenage Harold was forced to flee for his life, wounded and hunted. He escaped to Kievan Rus, then made his way to Constantinople, where he joined the Varangian Guard, the elite Viking mercenaries who served as the Byzantine emperor's personal bodyguards. For 15 years, Hardrada had fought across the Mediterranean and the Middle East. He had battled Arab pirates, crushed rebellions, and stormed fortified cities. He had accumulated a fortune in plunder and developed a reputation for tactical genius matched only by his ruthlessness. The Byzantines told stories of his cruelty, of how he once blinded an entire garrison of prisoners, of how he used deception and treachery as casually as other men used sword and shield. When he finally returned to Norway, Hardrada fought his way to the throne and spent the next 15 years expanding his kingdom through constant warfare. By 1066, he ruled Norway absolutely, and he was hungry for more. The English throne represented the culmination of a lifetime of conquest, and Hardrada approached it with the same methodical violence he had applied to every other obstacle in his path. The invasion fleet that assembled in Norwegian harbors that summer was staggering in size. 300 longships, each carrying 50 to 60 warriors, along with supplies, horses, and siege equipment. Historians estimate that Hardrada's invasion force numbered around 15,000 men, one of the largest armies assembled in northern Europe in the 11th century. These weren't farmers pressed into service. They were professional warriors, veterans of Hardrada's campaigns, men who made their living by the sword. When Harold Godwinson arrived with his own fleet and several thousand additional warriors, the combined force became truly terrifying. In early September 1066, this armada set sail from Norway, crossing the North Sea in a voyage that would have been visible for miles. Hundreds of dragon-prowed longships filling the horizon, their striped sails driving them toward the English coast. They made landfall in northern England in mid-September, and Hardrada immediately began doing what Vikings did best: spreading terror. The first target was Scarborough, a prosperous port town on the Yorkshire coast. When the town refused to surrender, Hardrada's forces built a massive bonfire on the cliffs above the settlement and pushed the burning pyre over the edge. The flaming debris crashed down onto the town's wooden buildings, and within hours, Scarborough was an inferno. Those who fled the flames ran straight into Viking blades. Those who stayed burned alive. The message was clear: submit or be destroyed. With Scarborough in ashes, Hardrada's army marched inland, following the River Ouse toward York, the great city that had once been the Viking capital of England. Harold Godwinson was still in the south, watching for William's invasion fleet, completely unaware that the north was already under attack. On September 20th, 1066, Hardrada's forces met the northern English army at Fulford, just 2 miles outside York. The English forces were led by 2 powerful earls, Edwin of Mercia and Morcar of Northumbria. They commanded a substantial army, perhaps 7,000 men, and they were fighting on their own territory with everything to lose. It didn't matter. The Battle of Fulford was a slaughter. Hardrada, drawing on decades of military experience, outmaneuvered the English forces, using the boggy ground to his advantage and driving Edwin and Morcar's army into a marshy area where they couldn't maintain formation. The Norwegian warriors, many of them wearing mail armor and wielding 2-handed axes, carved through the English lines with brutal efficiency. By the end of the day, the northern English army had been effectively destroyed. Edwin and Morcar survived, but thousands of their men did not. Bodies choked the River Ouse, and the fields outside York were carpeted with the dead. The earls retreated with their shattered remnants, and York's gates opened without further resistance. Hardrada entered the ancient Viking city in triumph. York had been the capital of the Norse kingdom of Jorvik for nearly a century before being absorbed back into England, and Hardrada saw himself as reclaiming what had always been Viking territory. He demanded hostages from the surrounding countryside and ordered provisions for his army. With York secured and the northern English forces crushed, Hardrada had every reason to believe that the conquest of England had begun in earnest. The Norwegian forces celebrated their victory. After the brutal sea crossing and the battles at Scarborough and Fulford, they had earned a rest. They had no idea that 300 miles to the south, Harold Godwinson had already received news of the invasion, and that the English king was about to attempt something that military historians still debate to this day. When Harold received word of the Norwegian invasion, he was facing the most crucial decision of his brief reign. William of Normandy's invasion fleet was still gathering across the Channel. The southern coast of England was vulnerable. If Harold marched north to face Hardrada, William could land unopposed and march inland before Harold could return. But if Harold stayed in the south, Hardrada would have time to consolidate his hold on northern England, and the kingdom would effectively be split in two. Harold chose to gamble everything on speed. He immediately began assembling his army, calling in his housecarls, the professional warriors who formed the core of his military power, and the fyrd, the levy of armed freemen who owed military service to the king. Then, in a display of leadership and logistical genius that deserves to be more famous than it is, Harold led his army north in one of the most remarkable forced marches in medieval military history. From London to Tadcaster, just south of York, is approximately 185 miles. Harold's army covered this distance in just 4 days. To put this in perspective, a modern infantry division would find this pace challenging. For an 11th century army, moving more than 40 miles per day was nearly impossible. They had no paved roads, no motorized transport, no sophisticated supply chain. Every man marched on foot, carrying his weapons and armor, eating whatever food could be scrounged from the countryside or carried in supply wagons that somehow kept pace with the main force. The coordination required to move 15,000 men at this speed boggles the mind. You can't just point an army in a direction and tell them to run. Rivers had to be forded or bridged. Narrow roads created bottlenecks. Men needed food and water. Horses needed rest. The sick and injured had to be dealt with. Somehow, Harold and his commanders managed all of this while maintaining a pace that would exhaust modern soldiers. The English troops who made that march must have been in agony. 4 days of forced marching in mail armor, carrying shields and weapons, sleeping in whatever shelter could be found along the roadside. Their feet would have been torn and bleeding, their muscles screaming. Many must have fallen out from exhaustion or injury, but they kept moving because they understood what was at stake. If they didn't reach York in time, there would be no England left to fight for. On the evening of September 24th, Harold's army arrived at Tadcaster, just 9 miles south of York. They had covered 185 miles in 4 days, and somehow they had done it without Hardrada receiving any warning. The Norwegian king, comfortable in his captured city, had no idea that the English army was less than a day's march away. Harold spent the night planning his attack. His men were exhausted, but they had achieved complete tactical surprise. Hardrada's army was divided. Some forces in York itself, others camped at Stamford Bridge, 7 miles east of the city, where they were gathering the hostages and supplies that Hardrada had demanded from the local population. If Harold moved immediately, he could catch the Norwegians separated and unprepared. September 25th, 1066, dawned warm and clear, an unusually pleasant late summer day in Yorkshire. At Stamford Bridge, roughly 2/3 of Hardrada's army, perhaps 10,000 men, were camped on both sides of the River Derwent, waiting for the local leaders to arrive with their tribute. The day was so warm that many of the Norwegian warriors had left their armor back in York. They were relaxing, perhaps swimming in the river, certainly not expecting battle. Then, from the west, dust rose on the horizon. At first, it might have been taken for the expected hostages and their escorts. But as the cloud drew closer, the terrible truth became apparent. It wasn't a tribute party. It was an army. Harold's army. 15,000 English warriors, appearing as if conjured from thin air, their shields catching the morning sun as they advanced in battle formation. The Norwegian camp erupted into chaos. Warriors scrambled for their weapons. Officers screamed orders. Men who had been relaxing moments before were now running for their lives toward the river, trying to reach the far bank where they might have a chance to form a defensive line. The problem was the bridge itself, a narrow wooden structure that could only accommodate a few men walking abreast. It was the only crossing point, and suddenly it had become the difference between life and death. The Norwegian warriors on the west side of the river were doomed. Caught without armor, scattered across the fields, they had no chance to form an effective defense. Harold's housecarls fell on them like wolves on sheep, cutting them down as they fled toward the bridge. Bodies tumbled into the river. Blood turned the shallows red. Those Norwegians who made it across the bridge tried desperately to form ranks on the eastern bank, but they were disorganized, outnumbered, and in many cases still unarmed. Harald Hardrada, the legendary Thunderbolt of the North, was caught on the wrong side of the river in the worst tactical position of his career. The army that he had led to victory at Fulford was now scattered, panicked, and dying. He could see the eastern portion of his force trying to organize a defense, but between him and them was that narrow bridge, and beyond it the English army was preparing to cross, and that's when one man changed everything. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, written within living memory of the battle, records what happened next with a mixture of admiration and frustrated awe. A single Norwegian warrior, a giant of a man, took his position on the bridge. He carried a massive battle axe, the kind of weapon that required 2 hands to swing and could split a man from shoulder to hip. He wore full armor, mail that covered him from neck to knee, a helmet that shadowed his face. The chroniclers don't record his name. They probably never knew it, but they never forgot what he did. The English army, fresh from their crushing attack on the western bank, moved toward the bridge in high spirits. They had caught the Norwegians completely by surprise. Victory seemed certain. All they had to do was cross the river and finish the job. The first English warriors onto the bridge probably thought the lone Norwegian would step aside or be quickly overwhelmed. They learned otherwise in the most violent way possible. The giant's axe came around in a whistling arc, and the first Englishman died before he could raise his shield. The second died trying to retreat. The third managed to engage, sword against axe. But in the confined space of the bridge, the Vikings' superior reach made the fight a foregone conclusion. He went down with his skull split open. The bridge was perhaps 12 feet wide and 100 feet long. Specific dimensions are lost to history, but we know it was narrow enough that only a few men could attack at once. For the English army, this created a tactical nightmare. They had 15,000 men, but only 3 or 4 could engage the giant at any given time, and they couldn't flank him because the bridge had nowhere to go but forward and back. Wave after wave of English warriors tried to force their way across. The giant killed them all. His axe never seemed to stop moving, and every swing ended a life. Men tried to rush him together, hoping to overwhelm him through sheer numbers. Their corpses piled up at the bridge's entrance. Men tried to engage him with spears, using their reach to stay beyond the axe's arc. He killed them too, grabbing spears and yanking their wielders off balance, then finishing them with brutal efficiency. The Anglo-Saxon chroniclers, writing later, tried to capture the magnitude of what they witnessed. They recorded that the giant held the bridge for over an hour. They estimated he killed more than 40 men. Some accounts say as many as 60. They described him as fighting with berserker fury, seemingly impervious to fatigue, his armor deflecting the blows that managed to get through his guard. Modern historians debate the precise details. Surely the numbers are exaggerated, they argue. Surely one man couldn't really hold off an entire army. But the story appears in multiple independent sources, and the core facts never change. One Norwegian warrior held that bridge. Dozens of English soldiers died trying to get past him, and for a critical period, perhaps an hour, perhaps less, the entire momentum of the battle ground to a halt because of a single man's courage and skill. On the eastern bank, the rest of the Norwegian army used that precious time to organize. Harald Hardrada, whatever his faults as a political leader, was a brilliant battlefield commander. He rallied his forces, got the unarmored men away from the front line, positioned his best warriors where they could do the most good. The shield wall began to form. That classic Norse defensive formation, where overlapping shields created a nearly impenetrable barrier. If Hardrada could create a solid defensive line, he might be able to hold long enough for the Norwegian forces back in York to arrive as reinforcements. But Hardrada's ability to organize his defense depended entirely on the giant holding the bridge. And on the eastern side of the Derwent, the English commanders were increasingly desperate. They had achieved total surprise. They had crushed half the Norwegian army. They had every advantage except one. They couldn't cross a single narrow bridge because one man wouldn't let them. Harold Godwinson's officers huddled in hurried conference. They tried everything they could think of. They sent their best warriors, the king's own housecarls who had trained for years in the art of combat. The giant killed them. They tried to shoot him with arrows, but his armor and shield deflected most shots, and he seemed to simply ignore the ones that got through. They tried to collapse the bridge by setting it on fire, but the wood was too green or too wet, and the giant simply stood in the smoke like something from a nightmare, still killing anyone who came close. Finally, according to legend, a Saxon soldier volunteered for what amounted to a suicide mission. He climbed into a wooden barrel or trough, the accounts vary on the exact details, and floated underneath the bridge. The wood planks that formed the bridge's deck were separated by gaps, necessary for drainage but also creating vulnerability from below. The Saxon soldier, beneath the feet of the battling giant, thrust his spear upward through one of these gaps. The spear caught the giant in the groin or lower torso. Again, the accounts differ. What they agree on is that the wound was mortal. The giant, who had seemed invincible, who had stood against an army for an hour or more, finally fell. Some accounts say he managed to kill a few more men even as he died, refusing to surrender even with a spear through his body. Others say he died instantly, toppling off the bridge into the river below. Either way, his time was up, and with his death, the dam broke. The English army flooded across the bridge like water released from a broken levee. Hundreds, then thousands of men poured onto the eastern bank, their blood up from the frustration of being held off for so long. The Norwegian shield wall, hastily formed and still incomplete, met them with desperate courage. What followed was one of the bloodiest close-quarters battles of the 11th century. The Norse warriors fought with the ferocity of men who knew they were doomed but refused to die easily. They held the shield wall for as long as they could, warriors stepping forward to fill the gaps as men fell, the line contracting but not breaking even as the English pressed them from all sides. Harald Hardrada, the legendary Thunderbolt of the North, died somewhere in that chaos. Some accounts say he was struck in the throat by an arrow. Others say he was cut down in close combat. However it happened, the greatest Viking warrior of his generation died on an English field, his dreams of conquest ending in blood and failure. Tostig Godwinson, Harold's exiled brother, died there too. When Harold sent a messenger offering terms, Tostig could have his earldom back if he would lay down his arms. Tostig reportedly asked what his ally Hardrada would receive. 6 feet of English ground, Harold replied, or 7, since he's taller than most men. Tostig chose to fight beside his Norwegian allies rather than abandon them, and he paid for that loyalty with his life. The Norwegian army was annihilated. Of the 15,000 warriors who had landed in England so confidently just weeks before, only a few hundred survived. The English sources say that of the 300 ships that had brought the invasion force across the North Sea, Only 24 were needed to carry the survivors home. The fields around Stamford Bridge were carpeted with Norse dead, and local legend claims that for years afterward, farmers would unearth bones and broken weapons when they ploughed. The Battle of Stamford Bridge was total and complete English victory. Harold had achieved what seemed impossible. He had force-marched his army nearly 200 miles, achieved tactical surprise, and crushed the largest Viking invasion force in a generation. The Viking Age, that era of Norse expansion that had begun nearly 3 centuries earlier with raids on defenseless monasteries, ended that day on a Yorkshire bridge. Never again would Scandinavian warriors threaten to conquer England. Harold Godwinson must have felt something like triumph as he surveyed the battlefield. He had defeated one of the greatest warriors alive. He had saved northern England from conquest. He had proven himself a capable military commander and a worthy king. The celebration lasted about 3 days. On September 28th, as Harold's exhausted army was still regrouping in York, a messenger arrived from the south with catastrophic news. William of Normandy had landed at Pevensey on the southern coast. While Harold had been fighting in the north, William had finally caught the favorable winds he needed and had crossed the Channel with his invasion force. He was now on English soil, fortifying his position and ravaging the countryside. Harold faced another impossible decision. His army was exhausted from the forced march north and the brutal battle at Stamford Bridge. His forces had taken significant casualties. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle doesn't provide exact numbers, but modern historians estimate Harold lost at least 20% of his army, including many of his most experienced warriors. The survivors were tired, wounded, and in desperate need of rest. But William was in the south, threatening London, and every day Harold delayed gave the Norman Duke time to consolidate his position. Once again, Harold chose speed over caution. He gave his army a brief rest in York, left garrisons to hold the north, and began the long march south. Once again, his men covered impossible distances in punishing time. Once again, they pushed themselves beyond what should have been humanly possible. On October 14, 1066, less than 3 weeks after Stamford Bridge, Harold's army met William's forces at Hastings. The battle raged all day, Harold's exhausted shield wall holding against repeated Norman cavalry charges. For hours, it seemed like the English might pull off another miracle victory. Then, late in the afternoon, Harold was killed. An arrow to the eye, according to the famous Bayeux Tapestry, though other sources describe different deaths. However it happened, the English king fell, and with him fell any hope of stopping the Norman invasion. William's forces broke through the English lines, and the Anglo-Saxon army collapsed. The Norman conquest of England had begun. William would be crowned king on Christmas Day, 1066. Over the next few years, he would systematically replace the entire Anglo-Saxon nobility with Norman lords, build castles across the country to enforce his rule, and fundamentally transform England in ways that echo down to the present day. The English language, English culture, English law, all of them would be reshaped by the Norman conquest. And historians have spent nearly 1,000 years asking the same question. What if? What if Harold's army had been fresh at Hastings instead of exhausted from 2 forced marches and 1 brutal battle? What if he hadn't lost 20% of his forces at Stamford Bridge? What if his best warriors hadn't been killed by Harald Hardrada's desperate last stand? Would Harold have won at Hastings? Would England have remained Anglo-Saxon instead of becoming Anglo-Norman? We can never know the answers, but we can trace the chain of causation backward, and when we do, we arrive at that bridge, that narrow wooden bridge over the River Derwent, where one unnamed Norwegian warrior held off an army. If the giant hadn't held the bridge, the battle would have been over in minutes. The Norwegian forces on the eastern bank would have been scattered and slaughtered before they could organize. Harold's army would have taken minimal casualties. They would have had days, perhaps even weeks, to rest before marching south. They would have met William at Hastings with fresh troops and full strength. Instead, because of one man's courage and skill, the Battle of Stamford Bridge became a grinding, brutal fight that cost Harold dearly. The giant's stand gave Hardrada time to organize a defense. That defense, though ultimately unsuccessful, killed and wounded hundreds or thousands of English warriors. Those casualties weakened Harold's army just enough that 3 weeks later, on a different battlefield, the exhausted English couldn't quite hold their line. One man, one bridge, 1 hour, and the entire course of English history changed. The story of the giant at Stamford Bridge was recorded almost immediately after the battle. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, compiled within living memory of the events, includes the account. Over the following decades and centuries, other chroniclers picked up the story. Medieval writers like Henry of Huntingdon and Roger of Wendover elaborated on the tale, each adding their own details and flourishes. The giant became a fixture in Norse sagas as well, though interestingly, the Icelandic sources that usually preserve names and lineages with obsessive detail never identify him. This has led to endless speculation about who he might have been. Was he one of Hardrada's personal guard, a champion warrior from the Norwegian king's own retinue? Was he a berserker, those legendary Norse warriors who fought in trance-like states of fury? Was he perhaps a local Englishman of Norwegian descent, fighting for his ancestral homeland? We will never know. Some historians have questioned whether the story is true at all. Medieval chroniclers were known to embellish, and a tale of one man holding off an army seems almost too perfect, too mythic to be real. But the core account appears in multiple independent sources, and the details are remarkably consistent. More importantly, the tactical situation makes sense. Narrow bridges have featured in military history for thousands of years, precisely because they create choke points where a small force can hold off a larger one. The Battle of Thermopylae, where 300 Spartans held off the Persian army, was fought at another narrow passage. What sets the Stamford Bridge giant apart is that he fought alone. Not 300 men, not even a small squad. One warrior, holding one bridge, for long enough to matter. Archaeological work at Stamford Bridge has been limited, but what excavations have occurred support the general outline of the battle. Weapons and armor fragments from the 11th century have been found in the area. The location of the bridge has shifted over the centuries due to changes in the river's course, but researchers have identified the likely location where the battle took place. Local tradition has preserved the memory of the fight for nearly 1,000 years, with place names and legends that echo the events of that September day. In modern times, the battle and the bridge giant have become important symbols of the Viking Age's end. September 25, 1066, is recognized by historians as a watershed moment. The last time a Viking army would threaten to conquer England, the raids and invasions that had terrorized Europe for 3 centuries ended on that bridge. The age of longships and warriors seeking glory and plunder gave way to an age of kingdoms and diplomacy, and more organized warfare. The giant himself has become something more than a historical footnote. His story resonates across centuries because it speaks to something fundamental about human nature. He wasn't fighting for conquest or treasure. By the time he took his stand on the bridge, the battle was already lost. The English had achieved total surprise. His army was scattered. His king was caught on the wrong side of the river. The giant must have known he was going to die. He chose to make that death matter. In a battle filled with famous names, Harald Hardrada, Harold Godwinson, Tostig, the anonymous warrior on the bridge became the most memorable figure. We don't know his name, don't know where he came from, don't know what he looked like beyond giant and well-armed. But we know what he did, and that action has echoed through history for nearly a millennium. Military historians study Stamford Bridge as a case study in the importance of tactical surprise and the risks of dividing forces. The bridge giant's stand gets analyzed as an example of how terrain can force a numerically superior army to fight at a disadvantage. But these analytical frameworks miss something essential about why the story endures. The giant on the bridge represents something that transcends military tactics. He represents the moment when an individual chooses to stand against impossible odds, not because victory is possible, but because standing is the only honorable choice. He represents loyalty to comrades, even when they're doomed. He represents the warrior's code carried to its absolute extreme. Keep fighting until you can't fight anymore, and even then, don't make it easy for them. Every culture has stories like this. Leonidas at Thermopylae, the defenders of the Alamo, the last stand of Custer's 7th Cavalry. These stories persist not because the military outcomes were in doubt. They weren't. But because they represent something we want to believe about human courage. When everything is lost, when defeat is certain, some people still choose to stand and fight. The giant at Stamford Bridge is particularly powerful because he was truly alone. He didn't have 299 Spartans standing with him. He didn't have the walls of a fort or the hope of reinforcements. He had a narrow bridge, an axe, and the certain knowledge that he was going to die. And he held that bridge for an hour against the entire English army. The mystery of his identity adds to the legend. If we knew his name, we could contextualize him. We could research his family, his previous battles, his motivations. We could turn him into a historical figure with complexity and nuance. Instead, he remains purely archetypal. The warrior who stands alone, the defender who won't yield, the man who holds the line. That anonymity makes him universal. He could be anyone. He could be you, if you were brave enough and skilled enough and desperate enough. That's the power of the story. It's not about one specific Norwegian warrior on one specific day. It's about the choice to stand when standing seems pointless. The consequences of his stand rippled through history in ways he could never have imagined. By holding the bridge, he gave his king time to organize a defense. That defense, though it ultimately failed, inflicted casualties on the English that would prove crucial 3 weeks later. Those casualties contributed to Harold Godwinson's defeat at Hastings, which led to the Norman conquest, which reshaped England forever. The English language you're reading right now was fundamentally altered by the Norman conquest. Old English, the language spoken before 1066, was Germanic in structure and vocabulary. The Normans brought French, and over the following centuries, English evolved into a hybrid language. Germanic grammar with enormous Latin and French vocabulary imported through the Norman French, legal systems, governmental structures, architectural styles, social hierarchies. All of them were transformed by William's conquest. Would any of this have happened if the giant had stepped aside? Would Harold have won at Hastings with a fresh, full-strength army? Would Anglo-Saxon England have survived? We can't know. But we can recognize that individual actions matter, that one person's courage can ripple outward in unexpected ways. The Battle of Stamford Bridge deserves to be better known than it is. In the popular imagination, 1066 means Hastings. That's the battle everyone learns about, the one that appears in textbooks and documentaries. Stamford Bridge, despite being militarily more impressive and tactically more interesting, gets relegated to a footnote, the thing that happened right before the main event. But Stamford Bridge was where the Viking Age ended. It was where the last great Norse invasion was shattered. It was where Harald Hardrada, who had terrorized 3 continents and carved a bloody path to the Norwegian throne, met his end on an English field. It was where Harold Godwinson proved himself a military genius, achieving a victory that should have secured his throne and his dynasty. And it was where one unnamed warrior, armed with an axe and clad in armor, stood on a narrow bridge and refused to move. For 1 hour, give or take, that bridge was the center of the world. Behind the giant, his army scrambled to form ranks. In front of him, 15,000 enemy soldiers tried everything they could think of to get past. and he killed every man who tried. The Anglo-Saxon chroniclers who recorded his death did so with a note of respect that seems remarkable given he was killing their countrymen. They recognized courage when they saw it, even in an enemy. The Norman chroniclers, writing decades later about the events leading up to their conquest, included the story because it was too good to leave out. The Norse saga writers preserved it because it embodied everything their culture valued about warriors and warfare. 959 years later, we're still telling the story. We're still trying to understand what drove that unnamed warrior to take his stand. We're still marveling at the sheer physical and mental endurance required to fight, alone, for an hour against an endless tide of enemies. We're still asking who he was, what he was thinking, whether he knew his defense was ultimately futile. The truth is, we'll never have those answers. The giant took them with him when he died. Whether he fell on the bridge or tumbled into the river below, his identity is lost to history, probably forever. No archaeological discovery is going to tell us his name. No new historical source is going to emerge after 1,000 years that fills in the blanks. But maybe that's appropriate. Maybe the power of the story comes from that anonymity, from the fact that he represents every warrior who ever held an impossible position. Every person who ever chose to stand when running was easier. Every moment of courage in the face of certain death. The giant at Stamford Bridge held his ground because that's what warriors did. He bought time for his comrades because loyalty mattered more than survival. He killed 40 or more enemies because he was skilled enough and strong enough and determined enough to do it. And when he finally died, stabbed from below by a desperate enemy who had no other option left, he had already achieved a kind of immortality. He held a bridge against an army. Everything else, the names, the dates, the tactical analysis, is just details. The core fact remains, stark and clear and impossible to ignore. One man stood where he had no hope of victory, fought until he had no strength left to fight, and in doing so, changed the course of history. That's the story of the giant at Stamford Bridge. That's why, nearly 1,000 years later, we still remember what he did, even though we don't know who he was. That's why his anonymous courage matters more than all the famous names around him. He held the bridge. That's all we need to know.